Welcome to the Leader's Way podcast. I'm Brandon Nappi. From the earliest moments of my children being able to speak, each night at bedtime after poetry and singing together, we would practice meditation. They were probably 3 years old, I would guess, at the time. And, until the day they moved out of the house and went to college, we practiced meditation every night. And I'm really thankful for that time. It certainly bonded us. It allowed them to develop a practice for themselves, a way to go within and have a spiritual practice, have a connection with not only themselves and their bodies, but also with the divine. I'm so thankful for all those times we spent together. And I was so heartened in my conversation with Father Laurence Freeman. We talked at some length about teaching meditation to children. This conversation is so beautiful as we get to hear from one of the great contemplative teachers, one of the great meditation teachers of our time. Father Laurence Freeman is a Benedictine monk who has been teaching meditation for many, many decades. And especially in this moment, as we face so much turmoil, so much violence in our culture, so much unrest, a kind of unraveling, it's my conviction that we need contemplative practices more than ever to keep us grounded. We need meditation more than ever to keep us from becoming what we hate. And so I'm just so grateful for this conversation with this very simple monk who's given his whole life to teaching people the power of meditation. If you don't know Father Laurence Freeman, let me share a little bit about him. Father Laurence is a Benedictine monk. He's currently the worldwide leader of the World Community for Christian Meditation. He was born in England in 1951, where he was educated by the Benedictines and John Main. He studied English literature at Oxford. And before entering the monastic life, he even worked at the UN and worked in banking and in journalism. Once in the monastery, his spiritual teacher was the renowned spiritual teacher, meditation teacher, Father John Main, and he helped Father John establish the first Christian meditation center in London. At the invitation of the Archbishop of Montreal in 1977, he accompanied Father John to establish a Benedictine community of monks and lay people dedicated to the practice and teaching of Christian meditation. Father Laurence studied theology at the University of Montreal and at McGill. He made his monastic profession. That means he formally became a monk in 1979 and was ordained to the priesthood in 1980. After the death of John Main in 1982, he continued the work of teaching meditation that had already begun to develop into a global community, which today we know as the International World Community for Christian Meditation. He teaches, he leads retreats, he's the author of a number of books, such as Jesus, the Teacher Within, Light Within, A Short Span of Days, and The Selfless Self. I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I did. Welcome to the Leader's Way podcast, a show for people who are not ready to give up on the world. We convene sacred conversations with luminaries, scholars, and spiritual leaders who explore the creative vision needed to lead change in our aching world. I'm Dr. Brandon Nappi, lecturer at Yale Divinity School and executive director of the Office of Transforming Leaders at Berkeley Divinity School at Yale. I'm so glad you're here. Father Laurence Freeman, welcome to the Leader's Way podcast.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
I'm so thankful for your presence here and all the work that you've done to help bring contemplative practices to the world in a fresh new way. And I always love beginning with our guests by hearing about their journey. It's one of the great blessings of my life to behold people's stories. And so would you bless me with your story? How did you come to the monastic life?
Kicking and screaming. I was working in banking because I had studied literature, English literature at Oxford, and I was intending to go back and have an academic path probably in literature. And at the last minute, I decided to do something completely different, as they say in Monty Python. And so I went into banking not because I was particularly drawn to it viscerally, but to see how the world ran and get a sense of that side of the universe, which I was quite unaware of. So then my spiritual teacher, Father John Main, Benedictine monk, returned to London, to his monastery in London, just at the time when I was ready to leave my banking world and launch into a more literary career. And he started a meditation center at his monastery, and with the idea of a lay community joining it for 6 months. And although that seemed quite extreme, at the same time it was attractive to me. So I joined, and it was a transformative 6 months. I learned to meditate finally. I'd been introduced to it some years before by him, but I had never really got into a discipline. And so now I had the opportunity of a structured day in a monastery with set times for work and prayer and study and the meditation three or four times a day, and under his guidance with a group of others. And it taught me a lot. It was difficult, challenging, but at the same time it brought me to a lot of self-knowledge, which is the real purpose of the practice. When the 6 months was up, I thought, well, that's good. I've run the course, and now I can go back to the real world. And to my dismay, I realized the things that I really had wanted to do no longer had the attractive power. That was really disturbing, because I didn't know what else to do, and I didn't feel I wanted to be a monk. I thought maybe one day I might become a monk, but I should become rich and famous first. And anyway, I was in that on the horns of that dilemma for a period of time, and then I had this brilliant idea, which was, well, why don't you try it? As soon as I had that thought and realized that's what I could do, I felt a great peace flood me. And then I thought, oh dear, I don't think I should be feeling peaceful about that, because that probably means that's what I'm supposed to be doing. And anyway, I did go and try, and this is what I was meant to be doing. And I expected to be in that monastery, for the rest of my life, and that was my plan. And I was helping John Main in his work of teaching meditation, Christian meditation at that time. But then, within 2 years later, after I'd done my basic boot camp training, I went with him to start a new monastery that would be dedicated essentially to the teaching and the practice of meditation. That's how I entered it, and I've gone through different stages of different forms of living the monastic life over the last 40 years, whatever it is. I've always had this love, really, of this particular kind of path, the monastic path.
Thank you. I wonder if you could share a little bit about what it was like to encounter John Main, and maybe say a few words about John Main for folks who might not be tracking this kind of trailblazing figure in 20th century spirituality, who integrated East and West in a way that that so many people are doing now. But I wonder, did it seem fresh and new and radical 50 years ago when this was unfolding?
It was fresh, and it was challenging, but it was also something that seemed to me and to him, of course, and to many others, inevitable and necessary. So it had that kind of certainty about it, but at the same time, it was breaking new ground. So I first met John Main actually at a Benedictine school that I went to when I was quite young, and he taught me one class, as I remember. But he became a figure in my life, formative figure in my life. But the turning point really was when I was in my first year at university at Oxford, and I was going through a very difficult personal time. My sister had just died, and I was going through other sort of questions and issues. And he invited me to his monastery, where it then was, in Washington, D.C., and I went out to spend Easter there. And in one of our conversations, he introduced me to meditation in a very few words and very simple way, in a light touch. But I knew as he spoke that this was somehow life-changing. And maybe it was because it confused me. Intellectually, I couldn't understand what he was talking about at all. Although I'd been reading quite a lot in world mystical literature, but hearing about the actual practice, it just seemed impossible. How could you leave your thoughts behind, and how could you go deeper than thought and imagination? It would be like taking the plug out of the computer. But at another level, which I could say was my heart, it touched that and awakened that in a new way. And it awakened me to a feeling of certainty that what I was hearing was utterly authentic. And although I couldn't understand it, I trusted it. And not only that, but it filled me with a kind of desire or a longing to experience it. But it took me a few years after that, before I joined the monastery and put my head under the yoke of a regular practice. But John Main was an amazing teacher. This is actually the 100th year of his birth.
Oh, wow.
We're celebrating this year throughout our global community by thinking of ways of renewing through expansion, but also through deepening the practice. So bringing it to more people, but also taking it deeper ourselves. If you expand but you don't go deeper, then you tend to dissipate yourself. So he was a very visionary person with a strong sense of purpose and confidence, insight, wisdom, but he always spoke simply and always brought the teaching back to practice. He wanted people to enter their own experience rather than just think about it. But he also very much taught by example. And so living and working with him and helping him in those years taught me, I think, more than anything else about what the truth of the scriptures are, what the truth of Christ is, and what the truth of a contemplative life is. Just seeing the way he handled life and problems and challenges, and with a joy, with a deep joy, a deep peace. And then finally, in the way he let go of life when he died at a young age of 56.
Wow.
Over a period of years, I recorded his weekly talks, 2 weekly talks at the monastery, 2 meditation groups coming there, and in a very primitive way compared with the technology we have today. But nevertheless, with the help of digital mastering and so on, we were able to bring it up to a high standard. And so, fortunately, we had the books, but we also had the spoken word, and that's a very important part of understanding, I think, how John Main, and I think any contemplative teacher, transmits what they have to say, and it is through the spoken word.
I wonder if you could say a bit about how John Main came to his own practice and the practice that he handed on to you, and if you could describe it for folks who are not as familiar with Christian meditation. I think many would hear the word meditation and maybe think of Zen, maybe think of Vipassana, various forms of meditation practice from outside the Christian tradition, especially from the Buddhist tradition. Of course, John Main had an encounter in India with mantra, and I wonder if you could say a little bit more about that, and then what exactly or how exactly did he pass along that practice to you, so that folks can get a real flavor of what this Christian meditation is.
John Main was born into an open-minded Catholic family. He served in the end of the Second World War, and then he studied law, and then he learned Chinese, and he went to Malaya, as it then was, Malaysia, to serve in the British Foreign Service there. He was Irish, but anyway, rather against his own ideals, he joined the British Colonial Service and worked there in a time of great political and social turmoil. And he was asked by the Governor-General to go out to visit a Tamil monk, Indian monk, on the outskirts of Kuala Lumpur one day, who was doing great work, just been made a Justice of the Peace by the British, and was asked to go and give thanks to this monk for his work for peace and reconciliation. And he had also started a center called the Pure Life Society, which had an orphanage for children who were victims of the war. And he brought up the children in their own faith. So while John Main was talking to this monk, he realized he was in the presence of a remarkable man of action and vision and social engagement, but also of deep spirituality and deep interiority. And he himself was a religious man, and so they began to talk about prayer, and the monk asked him if he prayed, and John Main explained yes, he did. And then that led them to talk about meditation, and the monk said, we meditate, and described the way of meditation that they followed, which was basically morning and evening to sit down in stillness and silence for about half an hour, close your eyes, and gently, faithfully repeat interiorly your mantra, your word. As he described this, he used a phrase from the Upanishads which touched John Main deeply, that we do this because, he said, we believe that the spirit of the one who creates the universe dwells within the human heart and in silence is loving to all. Now, John Main, as a practicing Christian, sensed this resonated with his own belief in the Spirit of Christ dwelling within him. And he asked this monk if he could teach him as a Christian to meditate. And the monk said, yeah, sure, you'll be a better Christian. So he said, I can teach you if you're serious. So John Main said to him, what do you mean by serious? So by serious, he said, I mean that you do it every day, morning and evening. And if you practice, then come here once a week, we'll meditate together and discuss anything that comes up. And that's what he did for about two years or more. Still meditating, he returned to Europe, became a professor of law, almost got married, and then was deeply moved by the death of a young nephew of his from a brain tumor, which revived his own long reflections on monastic life, and this led him to become a monk. When he became a monk, this is now in the late 50s, he was told to stop meditating because this wasn't Christian. And in obedience, he did. But he started to meditate again some years later when he realized in his position as headmaster, principal of a school in Washington, D.C., he could see that this generation of young people were passing through a formal kind of religious initiation or introduction to religious belief, but it was shallow and and evaporated very rapidly. And he realized that we needed to do something different. And that led him back to the roots of his own Christian monastic tradition, to the Desert Fathers and Mothers. And in the works of John Cassian from the 5th century, he found in the conferences on prayer the same method described in how to deal with distractions and how to come to poverty of spirit that he had been taught by his Indian teacher some years before. So he recognized it. He started to meditate again. That was the time when I went out to see him, and he introduced it to me. Good timing. And then he realized this was what he had to do. This was his work. And then that's what he did for the rest of his life.
Well, and thank goodness it did. As you know, his work and the practice has touched countless millions of people. And I wonder if you can name how Christian meditation fits within the greater, shall we say, family of Christian prayer, the different types of prayer. And I think sometimes when folks either come to meditation and find it so nourishing, or maybe they're nervous to even consider it, there's a kind of hierarchy that they might be contemplating, as if a certain form of prayer is superior to another form of prayer. I suspect John Main did not teach in that way, but how do you understand the relationship between Christian meditation and other beautiful forms of prayer within our tradition?
A good starting point is to say that there's really no forms or methods of prayer. Now, that might seem to be contradicted by what I have said and what I'm going to say, but there's a truth in that. The prayer is prayer. It is the prayer that Jesus taught in the Sermon on the Mount. Go into your inner room, close the door. Don't use too many words. Do not worry. Set your mind on God's kingdom before everything else. Be single-minded. And don't worry about tomorrow. Be in the present moment. So that is a definition, really, or description of contemplation. So if we're looking at this from the Christian perspective, which is, then Jesus is very clearly a teacher of contemplation. He warns us against the dangers of external prayer. Now, that's not to say he wasn't also a religious person, and he didn't say you shouldn't pray in other ways. But his teaching is on the target of contemplation. Interiority, silence, stillness of mind, freedom from anxiety, and being in the here and now. So, keeping that in mind, think of prayer as a wheel, and the different spokes of the wheel are like the different forms of prayer. Okay? And people have their favorite forms of prayer, and if you have your favorite form of prayer, maybe you feel critical of other people's forms of prayer. And, I never understand why people can waste time attacking other people's spiritual path. But
some people make a sport of it, don't they?
They do, yeah. It's a kind of entertainment. Anyway, think of these spokes of the wheel, the different forms of prayer, of vocal prayer, petitionary prayer, liturgical prayer, scriptural prayer, prayer of pilgrimage, prayer of I just was at a conference on yoga and Christianity. I mean, I think there's body prayer as well. So we can be very open about how we understand forms of prayer. Some are more obviously religious and some are not. But all these forms of prayer converge in the hub of the wheel. What do you find at the hub of the wheel? Well, you can answer that question theologically or physically. At the hub of a wheel, you find the axle and you find stillness. So there has to be stillness to allow the wheel to turn. That's the relationship between contemplation and action. They're not opposed to each other, and the energy of one transforms into the energy of the other. So, as Jesus explained in this parable of or the story of Martha and Mary, these two aspects are actually continually interacting, or two sides of the same coin, however you want to explain it. But they cannot be separated. So, stillness, be still and know that I am God, at the center of the wheel. Theologically, you can also say, from a Christian perspective, what do we find at the center of the wheel? We find the mind of Christ. And that means that we find the reality of the risen Christ, the consciousness of Christ, praying in us. And what is his prayer? Well, his prayer doesn't have a form, in a sense. His prayer is his own entry into his own true nature, and therefore into the divine life. So his prayer is his return to the Father in the Spirit, in love. And coming back to pick us up and to carry us with him, and for us to be transformed in that. So if you think of prayer then in this way, you don't get hung up on competition or upon levels of prayer and so on, because there is only prayer itself. And the Desert Fathers, who were very practical people, said the only thing you should pray for is prayer.
A question that I hear a lot from some of our students here at Yale Divinity School is regarding the relationship between mysticism and contemplative prayer. And in some ways, I can't help but wonder if this kind of question or this longing was very much the similar longing and question that Merton had when he came to the monastery. He had read, so many mystics, got to the monastery and said, well, show me what the prayer is that brings me to this encounter. I mean, you can imagine the young Merton being, very naive and, I want to be a mystic. Show me how to do it, right? And, all these years later, some of our students aren't very different from that. It's a very sweet kind of impulse. I wonder how you think about the distinction in these terms, or the relationship between what we might say mysticism, might describe as mysticism, which is kind of a fungible term, and the practice of Christian meditation.
I've just been rereading Wittgenstein, who was something of a tortured genius, of course, but he was tortured because he was struggling with whether philosophy meant anything. In a way, what he came to conclude is that philosophy is struggling, torturing itself over questions of its own devising, which are unnecessary, and that the real purpose of well, he says this actually, the main purpose of philosophy, the exact phrase, is to disengage us from the fascination that words exercise over us. Now,
I like this direction of travel. Continue.
So here is this great mind, this great person, clearly expressing a mystical insight beyond words, beyond form, rupa, as they say in Sanskrit, and the spiritual, and giving that intellectual respect, even though it does not allow intellectual analysis. What we can't speak of, we should be silent about, he says. So Christians, especially Western Christians, have created problems of their own making and have shed a lot of blood as well as a lot of ink over trying to win the argument on those questions. I would put it like this: mysticism is a very general term, but there are situations where it is a useful term to point to. I would say many of the great scientific minds of our time have ended up with a mystical view of the universe. You know, one of non-duality, one of infinity, and so on. And so the language of science and the language of the spiritual traditions for thousands of years, you know, often can resonate very powerfully together. Now, the word contemplation, a word that is also confusing because it can be used, was used at a certain period to describe a cognitive, intellectual, rational analysis of a scripture text or of certain religious ideas. So it was the mind, really, mental prayer working at a high oxygen level. But the deeper meaning of contemplation, which takes us back to its origin, really, is it means to be in the temple with. And templum did not originally mean a building or a structure, whether a physical or a mental structure. It meant the space in which a sacred act was performed. For example, divination at the time. So to be in the temple is to be in the temple, in the space in which the sacred is manifesting itself through perhaps a ritual action or through profound attention. Work of meditation, I think, does bring home to us the power of the metaphor that the body is a temple. And the heart is the Holy of Holies, as it were, within that temple. And the prayer of the heart, as St. Bonaventure said, we move beyond all the operations of the mind. We let go of thoughts, words, imagination, analysis, and so on. All the things that, when I first heard of meditation, I was clinging on to, and which we all cling on to as we learn to meditate and to let go of them. We have inherited a rather confused past, especially in Western Christianity, in which some of these words are used in a contradictory way. But in the Eastern Church, and of course in the Oriental traditions, there was a much greater familiarity with the idea of prayer as pure prayer, taking us beyond egocentricity, beyond language, beyond imagination. And I think we live in a very turbulent transitional period in which we are extricating ourselves painfully from the religiosity of the past, and a new experience of religion is taking shape, which is going to be much more powerfully focused upon this interior authenticity of prayer rather than the external or intellectual manifestations of it.
Yeah, thank you. I wonder if that's what you were pointing to in your article in the tablet when you described that the contemplative revolution that Jesus launched is entering a new phase. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about this and why, for so many Christian leaders, it's so difficult to transition into this new phase. I think there's a kind of reflexive wanting to preserve a phase that no longer seems to be meeting the needs of so many people. And I wonder what you see as the need that's being met here in this new phase that you see emerging.
Yeah, well, I think Jesus did launch the secular age when he called himself the Lord, I am the Son of Man, as Master of the Sabbath. That's pretty much the end of the old religiosity. And when he teaches the prayer that I was describing, he teaches, it's catching up with us. It took 2 millennia, it took the Reformation, and it took a great deal of confusion for us to come to this point where the old medieval worldview is disintegrating and forms of church come to their expiry date. So the essence of the idea of the secular, as Charles Taylor understood and has described better than anybody, the essence of the secular is that we have a choice. But all our choices in this situation are going to have a certain fragility about them. We have to be humble in the way we make these choices and understand them. I think the need for authenticity is stronger than the need for authority, external authority. Having said that, of course, you can also see, however, a sort of return to fundamentalism in many ways, but we have to try to discern the deeper tides that are at work. My own feeling is that, it's well expressed by the philosopher Jean Gebser, where he speaks about the different stages of consciousness in human evolution, which of course are repeated in the individual, beginning with the sort of unitive phase where we don't even know that we exist separately, then to the magical and the mythical, the rational, and then what comes after that. We would hope what comes after that is the integral phase, is a spiritual age. And this is the longing, a deep longing of modernity, is to reconnect to this spiritual reality in an authentic way. One of the interesting things that Gebser points out, which helps us to understand what we're going through at the moment, is that when a phase of consciousness comes to its natural conclusion, it becomes a very turbulent and chaotic and dangerous phase. And all that it has achieved will often become toxic. Now, for example, here we are, let's say, at the end of our rational phase of consciousness, where we have believed that reason and science could answer all questions and solve all problems. Well, we're beginning to realize that isn't the case, and that the very achievements and inventions that we have produced are causing us the greatest trouble. We don't know how to manage them. We're terrified of artificial intelligence. We are using nuclear energy in a completely negative way. And we are destroying our environment, using the very tools that we have created to do it. So, why is it important for us to teach meditation, you might say, while everybody's trying to scramble off the Titanic? Well, I think the answer is that there is a choice, and that the phase we're going through, we hope, will lead to a new and better phase of evolution. Either way, it is going to cause a lot of suffering and chaos. And many of the most vulnerable and innocent will be the victims of that, as always. And we see the total irrationality at work in American politics, in Russian politics, in Chinese economics, everything. So the reason that we should be thinking about the meaning of contemplation today and finding a way of contemplative practice that we are faithful to take us through, you could say it's a bit like a lifeboat, you know. And if you found a lifeboat where they take you on board or you can fit, you don't say, "Oh, I wonder if there's a better lifeboat than that one would be more comfortable." So I think hope is the real answer. If we don't have hope, then things will be bound to get worse, because we will not be using the forces that we are subject to and converting them into positive forces. Now, the interesting thing is this year we're having our John Main seminar will be in Washington, D.C., and it will be led by Tim Shriver. And Tim, as you will know, comes from an illustrious American family, the Kennedys, but he has used his position in life to do good work for others, like the Special Olympics, and now really focusing upon the challenges of our time and the polarization, the divisiveness, the violence, the breakdown of communication and conversation. So he'll be talking with us about that. And Tim is a meditator, and when you ask him, people ask him, what's the solution? He said, "I don't know, you know." But he would say, I think you'll hear him say that meditation is part of that solution. But maybe the most important thing we have to do, I would say, is we have to create a counterculture, or allow that to take shape and support that. And even that would be difficult, because there are lots of forces that will work against it. But to create a counterculture which cannot destroy the dark forces around us instantly, but at a certain point, and you see this in the teaching of Jesus, a small minority of committed, dedicated individuals working together across their belief systems, even across their faiths and across their traditions, can change the course of history. You or I or anybody or a group of people on retreat, when we meditate alone or meditate together, we are doing something of real and immediate value to the world as well as for ourselves.
So in some ways, Father Laurence, you're anticipating my final question, and which is around the connection between contemplation and action. You described Jesus' instructions for prayer so simply, go to your inner room and pray to your Father in secret. How do we come out of that room differently so that our contemplative life is connected to the world? And you named many of the challenges in the world right now. As we're recording this, we're seeing a kind of what some are calling an unraveling of American society and culture. We're seeing violence in our street, and we're seeing the failure of leadership at nearly every level of society, especially for those who might not understand the role that contemplation plays in the active life. Help us understand the kind of dynamism between contemplation and action, and I suspect these are not two radically separate things anyway. But how would you name it?
Contemplation is pure action. That becomes apparent in really great souls. But we all have a sense of what it means, could mean. And the purity of that action, which is its selflessness and the detachment from the results of the action. Do it. Do the right thing. And you don't need a 5-year plan. You need a 5-minute plan today. So do the right thing as best you can. Allow the fruits to unravel, to unfold, or to grow in their own way without you having to control them too much or to take credit for them or to worry about what it says about you or what you look like. I think that's the essence of contemplative action. You know, if you can meditate regularly, it's quite amazing how it changes you and changes your perspective on things. And you can't meditate regularly without purifying your heart. And that means what? It means getting rid of some illusions and fantasies and prejudices and simply stupid wrong ideas that you have accumulated or built up or inherited. So that will happen because the work of meditation, even when you feel you're failing at it, and the most important thing in learning to meditate is giving up the idea of success or failure. As you do that, you are already becoming enlightened, if you like. I mean, what is it then? How do we communicate that? Should we communicate it? Yes, I think we should communicate it. I don't think we should package it and sell it, but I think we should use all eligible means to communicate it. But I don't think we have to turn it into a marketing exercise. I think it will spread by itself, but we have to continue our fidelity to the work. You know, in the early centuries of Christianity, when Christianity was subject to persecution, and this was known as the Age of the Martyrs. We don't quite know how many, but I mean, certainly quite a few were thrown to the lions, and they were persecuted and martyred. But that was understood as the mystery of the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. If that's true, then there is still persecution of religion, different religions happening today, but the word martyr means a witness. And I think what we do need is ordinary people witnessing to the integrity and the value of the practice of contemplation in their ordinary lives, whether they're raising a family, running a company, painting paintings, or doing whatever they're doing with their lives. So they are the new martyrs. That's what I mean by this sort of contemplative revolution. You know, we're a multi-generational human family. Yet this is why we don't want to think about this in marketing terms. Who are we going to target? We're all targeted, the young and the old. But if you want to start at the beginning. Teach children to meditate. And I mean real meditation, the real thing, not daydreaming. Real meditation means you take the attention off yourself. And children love it. In fact, this morning here, there's a great church here in Ballally in Dublin, where I'm staying with my friend, the parish priest, has become a contemplative parish. And children from the 2 nearby schools come in regularly into the church, and he meditates with them, as I did this morning. Children like to meditate, they can meditate, and they ask for meditation. My own roots are in Ireland, on a place called Bear Island in West Cork. And it's the size of Manhattan, but has a population of 200. And so I go there as often as I can, but there's a school on the island with about 25 children. And sometimes I go in and I meditate with them. And then recently I was on the island, and a young guy asked if he could see me, and I met with him, and he was telling me his adventures and challenges he was having. And I asked him how he was coping, and he said, well, and I started meditating. And I said, oh, what kind of meditation are you doing? And he looked at me with a real look of surprise. And he said, well, the kind you taught me, you taught us. And that was 10 years before.
Oh, my goodness.
And when he needed it, it came back. And actually, in March, I'm going to Australia to work in Canberra with principals, school organisations who are really serious. Australia is the place which has introduced this control over mobile phones, for children under 16 at school anyway. They've already started teaching meditation systematically and naturally. You don't have to turn it into some big fancy operation. Just let it grow. Of course, you need the teachers on board and you need the parents on board. But when they see the effect on the children, it'd be very difficult to deny the value of it. So if there was one place to start, I would start with children at the beginning of their life journey.
Thank you for joining us today on the Leader's Way podcast, a show for people who are not ready to give up on the world. We hope you found the episode expansive and nourishing. If you enjoyed the episode, please be sure to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast on your favorite platform. Your support helps us to continue bringing you sacred conversations with luminaries, scholars, and spiritual leaders who are dedicated to transforming our world. For more information about our guests and to catch up on past episodes, visit our website at berkeleydivinity.yale.edu. Follow the show on Instagram at theleadersway.podcast to stay updated on future episodes and events. Until next time, I'm Dr. Brandon Nappi, walking with you as you lead with courage, wisdom, and compassion.